On a crisp November evening in 1861, 16-year-old Emma Muspratt stood before her bedroom mirror, admiring the exquisite emerald green ball gown that would make her the envy of every girl at the evening's assembly. The dress shimmered in the candlelight, its brilliant color so vivid, so impossibly rich, that it seemed almost alive. Emma's mother had spared no expense, commissioning the gown from London's finest dressmaker and requesting specifically that the fabric be dyed in the new fashionable shade everyone called Scheele's green. As Emma twirled before the mirror, tiny particles of the dye lifted from the fabric, floating in the air like glittering dust. She breathed them in without a second thought. 3 weeks later, Emma was dead, her organs systematically destroyed by the arsenic that created that beautiful, deadly green. She wasn't alone. In the relentless pursuit of beauty and fashion, thousands of Victorian women were slowly poisoning themselves, crushing their internal organs, setting themselves on fire, and dying in ways both spectacular and mundane, all in the name of appearing fashionable, desirable, and socially acceptable. Welcome to the dark underbelly of Victorian fashion, where beauty wasn't just painful, it was genuinely lethal. While we often romanticize the elaborate gowns, the tiny waists, and the porcelain complexions of 19th century women, we rarely discuss the horrifying reality behind these aesthetic achievements. The Victorians were essentially conducting a mass experiment in slow-motion poisoning, creating fashion and beauty products with substances we now know are deadly toxins. Arsenic in green dyes, lead in face powder, mercury in cosmetics, corsets that displaced organs and cracked ribs, crinolines that turned women into walking funeral pyres, footwear that deformed bones, hair dyes that caused paralysis and madness. This wasn't just uncomfortable or restrictive fashion. This was fashion that genuinely, measurably, and frequently killed the women who wore it. The story of Victorian fashion deaths begins with color, specifically the brilliant new synthetic dyes that revolutionized 19th century clothing and became instruments of death. Before the mid-1800s, fabric dyes came from natural sources like plants, insects, and minerals, producing relatively muted colors that faded quickly. But in 1856, 18-year-old William Henry Perkin accidentally discovered the first synthetic aniline dye while attempting to synthesize quinine in his home laboratory. He called it mauveine, and it produced a stunning purple shade that had previously been nearly impossible to achieve and incredibly expensive. The fashion world went mad for it. Queen Victoria herself wore a mauve silk gown to her daughter's wedding in 1858, sparking what became known as the mauve measles, a craze for purple clothing that swept through Victorian society. Perkin's discovery opened the floodgates for chemical dyes, and within a few years, chemists had created a rainbow of brilliant synthetic colors that made Victorian fashion more vivid and varied than ever before. But many of these dyes were based on compounds that we now recognize as deadly poisons. Arsenic-based dyes produced the most sought-after greens. Aniline dyes, while less immediately toxic than arsenic, still contained substances that caused skin reactions, respiratory problems, and in some cases, bladder cancer. Mercury compounds created brilliant reds and oranges. Lead created whites and certain yellows. Victorian women were literally wrapping themselves in toxic chemicals, and the fashion industry saw nothing wrong with this because the colors were simply too beautiful, too profitable, and too desirable to abandon for something as mundane as human safety. The arsenic green dyes deserve special attention because they were simultaneously the most popular and the most deadly. Two shades dominated Victorian fashion: Scheele's green, created in 1775 by Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, and an even more vibrant shade called Paris green, or emerald green, developed in 1814. Both used copper arsenite or copper acetoarsenite to achieve their brilliant color, and both were extraordinarily toxic. The fashion industry used these dyes extensively in clothing, artificial flowers, accessories, and even in wallpaper and home decorations. A single ball gown in fashionable green could contain enough arsenic to kill dozens of people if extracted and administered directly. The mechanism of arsenic poisoning from clothing was insidious because it happened slowly and was rarely connected to fashion until the deaths became impossible to ignore. When arsenic-dyed fabric rubbed against skin, especially sweaty skin during dancing or physical activity. Small amounts of the poison could be absorbed transdermally. When the fabric degraded or was brushed vigorously, arsenic particles would become airborne and be inhaled. When women touched their arsenic-green gloves to their faces or mouths, they ingested the poison directly. The symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, skin lesions, numbness in extremities, were often attributed to other causes or dismissed as typical female ailments. Doctors had no framework for understanding that a woman's beautiful dress might be slowly killing her. Matilda Schurer's death in 1861 finally brought the arsenic dye problem into public consciousness, though it didn't stop the fashion industry from using the deadly substance. Matilda worked in a London factory that produced artificial flowers. Many of them dyed with arsenic green. At 19 years old, she was exposed to arsenic dust constantly as she shaped and arranged the flowers. She began experiencing severe symptoms. Her eyes turned green from arsenic deposits. She vomited green liquid, her fingernails took on a greenish tinge, and she suffered convulsions and delirium before finally dying in agony. Her physician, Dr. William Fraser, was appalled by what he witnessed and began campaigning publicly against arsenic dyes. He testified at inquests, wrote letters to newspapers, and gave public lectures about the dangers. His efforts raised awareness, but changed the industry surprisingly little, because the colors were simply too desirable and too profitable. The British Medical Journal published article after article documenting arsenic poisoning from clothing and home decorations. They described cases of children dying from sleeping in rooms with arsenic-green wallpaper, of women developing severe skin conditions from wearing arsenic-dyed stockings and gloves, of dance partners being poisoned by inhaling arsenic dust from their partners' gowns during vigorous dancing. One particularly horrifying account described a dinner party where multiple guests became violently ill after sitting in a room with new arsenic-green wallpaper and curtains. The warmth from candles and body heat had caused the wallpaper to release arsenic gas, poisoning everyone in the room. The homeowner's young daughter, who spent the most time in that room, died within weeks. Despite mounting evidence and public outcries from physicians and reformers, the fashion industry resisted changing its practices because arsenic greens were simply too beautiful and too popular. When one London department store announced it would no longer sell arsenic-dyed products in 1862, customers protested. Women wrote letters demanding access to the fashionable colors. The store reversed its policy within months. This incident revealed a disturbing truth about Victorian priorities. Beauty and fashion compliance trumped personal safety for many women and the people who profited from their consumption. The cultural context helps explain this seemingly irrational choice. Victorian women had extremely limited options for exercising agency, displaying wealth, or achieving social success. Fashion was one of the few arenas where women could compete, express themselves, and demonstrate their family's status. The social pressure to dress fashionably was immense, and the consequences of failing to do so could include social ostracism, reduced marriage prospects, and family disgrace. In this context, some women made the calculated decision that the social risks of unfashionable clothing outweighed the health risks of toxic dyes, especially since those health risks were poorly understood and often manifested slowly over time rather than immediately. The arsenic problem wasn't limited to green dyes, though those were the most toxic. Victorian fashion used a horrifying array of poisonous substances to achieve various colors and effects. Vermilion, a brilliant red pigment used in fabrics and cosmetics, contained mercury sulfide. Prolonged exposure caused mercury poisoning with symptoms including tremors, mood swings, insomnia, and cognitive decline. Lead chromate produced bright yellows and oranges but caused lead poisoning with effects ranging from anemia and nerve damage to kidney failure and death. Antimony, used in some red and orange dyes, caused symptoms similar to arsenic poisoning. The Victorian wardrobe was essentially a chemistry set of toxic compounds worn directly against the skin. If you're shocked by what these women endured just to achieve fashionable colors, make sure you subscribe, because what you'll discover about how their undergarments and accessories literally crushed and deformed their bodies will leave you absolutely horrified. The corset, perhaps the most iconic element of Victorian women's fashion, deserves its own extended examination as an instrument of bodily harm. The Victorian ideal of feminine beauty centered on an extremely small waist, creating the fashionable hourglass silhouette that dominated the era. Achieving this look required corsets, rigid undergarments reinforced with whalebone, steel, or wood that compressed the torso into the desired shape. Women began wearing corsets in childhood and continued throughout their lives, progressively tightening them to achieve smaller and smaller waist measurements. The practice of tightlacing, pulling corset laces as tight as possible to minimize waist size, became common among fashionable women despite mounting medical evidence of its harmful effects. The immediate physical effects of tight corseting were obvious to anyone who wore one. Breathing became restricted as the compressed ribcage couldn't fully expand. Digestion was impaired as the stomach and intestines were crushed and displaced. Blood circulation was reduced as vessels were constricted. Movement became limited as the rigid garment prevented natural bending and twisting. Women regularly fainted from oxygen deprivation, particularly in warm, crowded rooms or during physical exertion. The Victorian era saw fainting become so common among fashionable women that it was considered almost normal, even somewhat delicate and feminine. Smelling salts became a standard accessory. Furniture was designed with fainting in mind, hence the fainting couch. But this normalized swooning was actually a symptom of the body being deprived of adequate oxygen due to compressed lungs. The long-term effects of corseting were far more serious and are well documented in medical literature from the period and in modern examinations of Victorian skeletal remains. Ribs were permanently deformed, compressed inward at unnatural angles. Some women's ribs were actually fractured by the pressure of extreme tight lacing. The liver was compressed and sometimes damaged, pushed downward and backward into unnatural positions. The stomach was displaced, leading to chronic digestive problems. The intestines were crushed and twisted, causing constipation, pain, and in extreme cases, dangerous blockages. The uterus could be displaced, potentially affecting fertility and pregnancy. The spine was forced into unnatural curvature. Muscles in the torso atrophied from not being used, as the corset essentially replaced muscular support with external structure. Women who tight-laced for years often found they couldn't stand upright without their corsets because their own muscles had wasted away. Modern medical examination of Victorian women's skeletal remains shows dramatic physical changes from corseting. CT scans and X-rays reveal ribs bent at angles that would be impossible without external force. Spinal curvatures consistent with prolonged compression, and evidence of fractures and skeletal stress. Anthropologists can identify whether skeletal remains are from the Victorian era, partly based on the distinctive rib deformation patterns caused by corseting. These aren't subtle changes, they're dramatic skeletal alterations that demonstrate the extreme physical forces Victorian women subjected their bodies to in the name of fashion. The medical profession was divided on corseting throughout the Victorian era. Many doctors condemned the practice, writing extensively about its harmful effects and pleading with women to abandon or at least moderate their corseting. Dr. Robert Dickinson, an American gynecologist, created detailed medical illustrations showing the displacement of organs caused by tight lacing, comparing normal organ position with the compressed, displaced arrangement found in tight lacers. His illustrations are genuinely shocking, showing the liver pushed far down from its natural position, the stomach compressed to a fraction of its normal size, and the intestines twisted into unnatural configurations. Dr. Arabella Keneally wrote passionate denunciations of corseting in British medical journals, arguing that it was causing physical degeneration in women and would lead to weaker offspring and racial decline. Using the pseudo-scientific language typical of Victorian medical discourse, but making fundamentally accurate observations about the health harms. Other physicians defended moderate corseting, arguing that some support was necessary or even beneficial for women's supposedly weaker frames. This debate often had gendered dimensions, with male doctors sometimes claiming women needed external support because their bodies were naturally inferior and weaker than men's. Some physicians argued that the real problem wasn't corseting itself, but excessive tight lacing, and that moderate, properly fitted corsets were actually healthful. This position ignored the structural reality that even moderate corseting still compressed the torso significantly, and that the line between moderate and excessive was entirely subjective and culturally determined. The tragic case of Mary Halliday illustrates the extreme dangers of tight lacing. Mary was a young woman from a respectable middle-class family, engaged to be married, and determined to have the smallest waist possible for her wedding. She embarked on an aggressive tight-lacing regimen, having her corsets laced progressively tighter over several months. On her wedding day in 1888, her waist measured an astonishing 16 inches, achieved through extreme compression. During the wedding breakfast, Mary complained of severe pain and difficulty breathing. Within hours, she collapsed. Doctors were called, but could do nothing. Mary died that evening, her wedding day transformed into her funeral. The autopsy revealed that her liver had been lacerated by her deformed ribs, causing massive internal bleeding. The corset had literally crushed her to death. Mary's death was unusual in its drama and immediacy. Most corset-related harm accumulated slowly over years rather than killing suddenly. But her case became famous precisely because it demonstrated in undeniable terms what corseting could do to the human body. Newspapers covered the story extensively, moralists used it as a cautionary tale, and anti-corseting activists cited it as proof of the practice's dangers. Yet fashion barely changed. Women continued tight lacing throughout the remaining decades of the Victorian era and into the Edwardian period. The social pressure to conform to beauty standards proved stronger than the fear of physical harm, a calculus that recurs throughout the history of dangerous fashion. The corset wasn't just harmful through direct compression, it also created secondary health problems that physicians increasingly recognized as the century progressed. The restriction of breathing capacity left women more vulnerable to respiratory infections like pneumonia and tuberculosis. The digestive impairment caused by stomach compression led to widespread digestive disorders among fashionable women. The reduced mobility and weakened core muscles contributed to poor physical fitness and easy fatigue. Some doctors argued that corseting contributed to the general poor health that was common among upper-class Victorian women, who were often depicted in literature and medical writing as perpetually weak, prone to fainting and illness, and lacking in physical vigor. This weakness wasn't inherent to female biology as Victorian ideology claimed. It was at least partly caused by the restrictive garments women were forced to wear. Pregnancy presented special dangers for corseted women. The expanding uterus needed space, but tight lacing during pregnancy compressed the growing fetus and could cause miscarriage, premature birth, or fetal abnormalities. Medical journals documented cases of women who continued corseting throughout pregnancy with tragic results. Yet the social pressure to maintain a fashionable silhouette was so intense that some women tried to hide their pregnancies as long as possible through tight lacing, risking their baby's health and their own. Maternity corsets were developed that claimed to provide support without dangerous compression, but these often still restricted the body significantly and reflected the reality that even pregnancy didn't fully exempt women from fashion expectations. The reform dress movement emerged in the mid to late Victorian era, partly in response to the health hazards of corseting and restrictive clothing. Reformers advocated for looser, more comfortable clothing that would allow women to breathe and move naturally. They designed alternative garments, promoted rational dress principles, and gave lectures about the health benefits of abandoning the corset. The movement gained some traction, particularly among educated, progressive women and those involved in early feminist activism. But it also faced enormous ridicule and resistance. Women who adopted reform dress were mocked in newspapers and magazines, caricatured as unfeminine and unattractive, and sometimes socially ostracized. The social cost of wearing rational dress was high enough that many women who privately agreed with reformers' health arguments continued wearing conventional fashion publicly to avoid stigma. The aesthetic dress movement offered a different approach to fashion reform, promoting beautiful but less restrictive clothing inspired by pre-Raphaelite art and medieval styles. Aesthetic dress was looser and more flowing than conventional Victorian fashion. Often made from softer fabrics in artistic colors, and sometimes worn without corsets or with much lighter corseting. This movement had more success than purely health-focused reform dress because it offered an alternative aesthetic rather than just abandoning fashion entirely. Women could feel beautiful and artistic in aesthetic dress rather than simply practical. But aesthetic dress remained a niche choice, associated with artistic and intellectual circles rather than mainstream fashion. The physical restriction imposed by corsets interacted dangerously with other elements of Victorian fashion to create compounded hazards. The massive crinolines and hoop skirts that dominated mid-Victorian fashion were already problematic on their own, but when combined with tight corseting that restricted breathing and mobility, they became even more dangerous. A woman in a crinoline and tightly laced corset could barely bend at the waist, couldn't run effectively, had limited peripheral vision because of her wide skirts, and couldn't respond quickly to dangers because of breathing restriction and physical constraint. This combination of limitations would prove deadly when fire entered the picture, as it so often did in the era of open flames and flammable fabrics. Make sure you hit that subscribe button because the horrifying ways Victorian women's clothing caught fire and the agonizing deaths that resulted will shock you to your core. Fire was perhaps the single most deadly hazard of Victorian fashion, and the stories of women burning to death in their elaborate dresses are among the most horrifying in the entire catalog of fashion-related deaths. Victorian homes and social spaces were filled with open flames from candles, oil lamps, gas lighting, and fireplaces. Women's fashion included massive amounts of fabric in crinolines, bustles, and long trailing skirts that easily swept across flames or candles. Many fabrics were highly flammable. The combination was catastrophic. Thousands of women died in clothing fires during the Victorian era, often in public spaces, surrounded by people who could do nothing to help them. The crinoline, that enormous cage-like structure of steel hoops worn under skirts to create the fashionable bell-shaped silhouette of the 1850s and 1860s, was particularly deadly in fires. Crinolines could span 6 feet or more in diameter, making it impossible for women to gauge where their skirts were in space, especially behind and to the sides. A woman in a crinoline couldn't see if her skirt edge was near a candle or fire, couldn't feel it until flames had already caught the fabric, and couldn't move quickly to escape once fire started. The structure also created a chimney effect, where air could flow up through the center of the crinoline, feeding flames and causing them to spread with terrifying speed. Once a crinoline caught fire, the woman wearing it was essentially trapped in a burning cage of fabric and steel. The death of 14-year-old Margaret Davey in 1858 illustrates the horror of crinoline fires. Margaret was attending a ball in London when her dress swept across a candle on a low table. The muslin fabric, treated with highly flammable starch and sizing, ignited instantly. Within seconds, her entire crinoline was engulfed in flames. Witnesses described the flames shooting 6 feet in the air, fed by the air current through the crinoline structure. Men attempted to throw their coats over her to smother the flames, but the size of the burning crinoline made it impossible to cover effectively. Someone tried to push her to the ground to roll out the flames, but the rigid steel hoops prevented her from lying flat. Margaret ran in panic, which only fed the flames with more oxygen. She died within hours from massive burns covering most of her body. The ballroom had dozens of witnesses, but none could save her because the very structure of her fashionable dress made rescue impossible. Margaret's death was not unique. Newspapers regularly reported on women and girls dying in crinoline fires. The deaths followed similar patterns. A dress catches on an open flame. The fire spreads with devastating speed through yards of fabric. The woman cannot remove the burning garment because Victorian dresses fastened with dozens of tiny buttons and hooks that required assistance to undo. The crinoline structure prevents effective smothering of flames. The victim dies in agony from severe burns. Some women jumped from windows trying to escape the flames. Others ran outside and died in the street. Many burned to death in their own homes, while family members watched helplessly. The statistics on crinoline fire deaths are imprecise because comprehensive records weren't kept, but fragmentary evidence suggests the toll was enormous. One London coroner estimated that he had personally conducted inquests on at least 40 fire deaths involving crinolines in a single year. Medical journals reported on the phenomenon regularly. The British Medical Journal campaigned against crinolines specifically because of their fire hazard. Reform advocates used crinoline fire deaths as arguments against fashion excess. Yet the style persisted for years because fashion dictated it, because women who didn't wear crinolines looked unfashionable and dowdy, because the social pressure to conform overwhelmed the fear of burning to death. The problem wasn't just crinolines. All Victorian women's fashion involved large amounts of fabric that posed fire hazards. Bustles, the structures worn to create exaggerated rear silhouettes in the 1870s and 1880s, also caught fire easily. Long trailing skirts swept across flames and candles. Elaborate sleeve decorations dangled near candles. Veils and hair accessories made from net and gauze were extraordinarily flammable. The entire structure of Victorian women's dress seemed designed to maximize fire risk, and indeed, it was designed with no consideration of fire safety whatsoever, because fashion imperatives completely dominated over practical safety concerns. The fabrics themselves compounded the fire hazard. Many Victorian fabrics were treated with finishes and sizings to achieve fashionable textures and shapes. Starches made fabrics stiff, but also highly flammable. Gum arabic and other sizing agents increased fabric's ignitability. Some fabrics were printed or treated with volatile substances that made them even more dangerous. Muslin, a popular lightweight fabric for summer dresses and evening wear, was particularly prone to catching fire and burning rapidly. Cotton fabrics treated with certain finishes could ignite from a spark and burn so quickly that escape was impossible. The flammable fabric problem worsened when cheap cotton fabrics were treated to look like more expensive silks. These imitation silks, called artificial silks or cotton silks, used chemical treatments that made them look lustrous and silk-like, but also made them extraordinarily flammable. Poor and working-class women who couldn't afford real silk but wanted fashionable clothing often wore these dangerous imitations, making fire deaths even more common in the working classes than among the wealthy who could afford less flammable genuine silks. One particularly horrific incident involved a factory fire in a London garment workshop in 1859, where 18 young women died, many of them wearing the crinolines and flammable fabrics they were employed to make. When fire broke out, the women's elaborate dresses caught fire almost simultaneously. The narrow factory stairs and exits became clogged with burning crinolines that were too wide to pass through doorways efficiently. Witnesses outside heard the screams but could do nothing. The incident led to some workplace safety reforms, but did little to change fashion itself, even though the connection between clothing and death toll was undeniable. Fire wasn't the only way Victorian clothing could cause sudden death. Drowning was another significant hazard, particularly in the crinoline era. The massive volume of fabric in crinolines could absorb enormous amounts of water and become incredibly heavy when wet. Multiple cases were documented of women drowning because their waterlogged crinolines dragged them under. The steel hoops prevented them from swimming effectively, and the weight of wet fabric made it impossible to reach shore even in relatively shallow water. Women drowned crossing streams in the countryside, falling from boats, even trying to wade at the beach. Their fashionable clothing literally pulled them to their deaths. The case of Ellen Stokes in 1863 exemplified this danger. Ellen was walking along a riverside path when her crinoline caught on a branch, causing her to lose balance and fall into the river. The water was only 4 feet deep, but Ellen couldn't right herself because her crinoline filled with water and its structure prevented her from standing. Witnesses saw her struggling just yards from shore, but couldn't reach her in time. She drowned in shallow water in front of multiple people because her dress made it impossible for her to save herself. The inquest attributed her death to accidental drowning, but contemporary observers noted that without the crinoline, she almost certainly would have survived. These fire and drowning deaths highlight a crucial aspect of Victorian fashion danger. The clothing didn't just harm women slowly through poison and compression, it also created acute hazards that could kill quickly and horrifically. The very structures and fabrics that created fashionable silhouettes also created death traps that women wore daily, often multiple times surviving near misses with flames or water before finally succumbing to a fatal incident. The normalization of this danger, the way society simply accepted that women would occasionally burn or drown because of their clothing, reveals how completely fashion imperatives dominated over basic safety concerns. The Victorian approach to beauty extended beyond clothing to cosmetics and personal care products that were often as toxic as the dyes and fabrics. The ideal Victorian complexion was extremely pale, almost translucent, suggesting a life of leisure protected from sun and manual labor. Achieving this look required cosmetics, and Victorian cosmetics were frequently laced with deadly poisons. Lead-based face powders and paints were enormously popular throughout the era, despite being recognized as dangerous. Women applied compounds containing white lead directly to their faces daily, gradually poisoning themselves in the pursuit of fashionable pallor. Lead poisoning from cosmetics caused a range of horrifying symptoms. The lead was absorbed through the skin and accumulated in the body over time. Early symptoms included headaches, digestive problems, and fatigue, which were easily dismissed or attributed to other causes. As poisoning progressed, victims experienced more serious effects, including anemia, nerve damage causing weakness and tremors, kidney damage, and cognitive impairment. Severe cases resulted in paralysis, seizures, and death. The process was usually slow, taking months or years of regular use to cause severe harm, which made it difficult for victims to connect their illness to their cosmetics. The case of Lady Maria Coventry provides a famous example of death from cosmetic lead poisoning. Lady Coventry was celebrated as one of the great beauties of her era in the mid-18th century, and she maintained her famous complexion through liberal use of lead-based cosmetics. Despite warnings from her physician about the dangers, she continued using lead cosmetics because she believed her beauty was essential to her social position and marriage. She died at age 27, likely from lead poisoning, though the exact cause was debated. Her death became a cautionary tale, but it did little to reduce lead cosmetic use because the alternatives didn't provide the same dramatic whitening effect that fashion demanded. Mercury was another common cosmetic ingredient with devastating effects. Mercury compounds were used in various preparations, including some face creams, freckle removers, and anti-aging treatments. Mercury poisoning caused symptoms including tremors, insomnia, mood swings, depression, and cognitive decline. Severe cases resulted in kidney damage, respiratory failure, and death. The phrase "mad as a hatter" originated from mercury poisoning among hat makers who used mercury in felt production, but cosmetic mercury exposure also caused mental and neurological damage in the women who used these products. Belladonna, the deadly nightshade plant, was used cosmetically despite being a well-known poison. Women dropped belladonna extract into their eyes to dilate their pupils, creating a wide-eyed look that was considered attractive and youthful. The practice was dangerous not just because belladonna is toxic, but because pupil dilation reduces vision acuity and makes eyes extremely sensitive to light. Women who used belladonna eye drops regularly sometimes experienced blurred vision, light sensitivity, and in extreme cases, vision damage or blindness. The narcotic properties of belladonna also caused drowsiness and confusion, yet women used it anyway because large pupils were fashionable. Antimony, a toxic metallic element, appeared in various cosmetic preparations including some face powders and creams. Antimony poisoning caused symptoms similar to arsenic poisoning, including nausea, vomiting, and organ damage. Bismuth, another metallic element used in cosmetics, was generally less toxic than lead or mercury, but could still cause problems with prolonged use. The Victorian cosmetics industry essentially offered women a choice of different poisons, each with its own characteristic harms, all in the service of achieving fashionable beauty. If you're stunned by the toxic makeup these women applied to their faces daily, make sure you subscribe, because what you'll learn about their deadly hair treatments and the dangerous accessories they wore will absolutely horrify you. Victorian hair fashion created its own catalog of horrors. The ideal Victorian hairstyle varied by decade but generally involved elaborate arrangements of curls, braids, and structures that required enormous amounts of hair. Many women didn't have sufficient natural hair to create these elaborate styles, leading to a massive market for false hair in the form of wigs, hairpieces, switches, and extensions. The false hair industry was substantial and often disturbing, with hair collected from the poor, from prisons, from corpses, even from plague victims in some cases. Women wore hair from unknown sources, potentially carrying diseases, positioned directly against their scalps. The chemicals used to dye and treat hair were frequently toxic. Lead-based hair dyes were common for darkening hair, causing the same lead poisoning as facial cosmetics. The application process was even more dangerous because dyes were applied to the entire scalp, providing maximum skin contact for absorption. Reports documented cases of women developing lead poisoning symptoms after using hair dyes regularly, including tremors, weakness, and cognitive problems. Some died from accumulated lead exposure from both cosmetics and hair treatments. Other hair dyes used equally dangerous chemicals. Silver nitrate was used to darken hair, but could cause severe skin reactions and, in some formulations, poisoning. Pyrogallic acid, derived from gallic acid, was used in hair dyes, but could cause skin inflammation, kidney damage, and in severe cases, death. Aniline dyes, the same synthetic dyes used in fabrics, were also used for hair coloring, despite evidence that they could cause allergic reactions, skin damage, and bladder cancer with prolonged exposure. The case of Madame Gabrielle d'Estrées, a Parisian hairdresser who died in 1887, illustrated the dangers of hair dye chemicals. Madame d'Estrées worked with hair dyes daily, mixing and applying them to clients and herself. Over several years, she developed progressively worsening symptoms including severe headaches, tremors, and eventually paralysis. Medical examination revealed extensive nerve damage consistent with heavy metal poisoning. She died at age 34, her body saturated with lead, silver, and other metallic poisons from a career working with toxic hair treatments. Her death was attributed to occupational exposure, but her clients who used the same products faced similar if slower risks. Hair curling methods also posed dangers. The curling iron had been used for centuries, but Victorian curling irons were heated directly in fires or over gas flames, often reaching extremely high temperatures. Burns from curling irons were common, ranging from minor singeing to severe burns that left permanent scars. More serious were incidents where heated curling irons ignited hair, particularly when combined with the flammable hair oils and pomades that were fashionable. Multiple cases were documented of women whose hair caught fire during curling, leading to facial burns, scalp burns, or, in extreme cases, full clothing fires when burning hair ignited dresses. The elaborate hairstyles themselves could cause health problems. The weight of heavy false hair pieces combined with tight pinning could cause headaches and hair loss. Styles that required pulling natural hair tightly back caused traction alopecia, permanent hair loss from sustained pulling. Some women experienced neck and back pain from supporting the weight of elaborate hairstyles. The time and effort required to create fashionable hairstyles also had health impacts, with women spending hours in uncomfortable positions while their hair was arranged, sometimes developing muscle strain or fatigue. The hairpins and decorative hair accessories that secured these elaborate styles presented their own dangers. Long, sharp hairpins could cause scalp wounds that became infected. Decorative combs and pins were often made from celluloid, an early plastic that was extremely flammable. Multiple cases exist of women's hair catching fire when a spark landed on a celluloid hair ornament, which then ignited and spread flames to the hair and often to clothing. The celluloid problem became so recognized that some jurisdictions attempted to ban celluloid combs and hairpins, though enforcement was difficult and the items remained popular because they were cheaper than alternatives made from tortoiseshell, horn, or metal. Footwear represents another category of fashion harm that particularly affected Victorian women. The fashionable shoe was narrow, pointed, and often quite small, forcing feet into unnatural shapes. Wealthy women took pride in having tiny feet, which supposedly indicated delicacy and refinement. Achieving this look required shoes that were too small and too narrow, causing immediate pain and long-term deformation. Bunions, hammer toes, corns, and other foot problems were nearly universal among fashionable Victorian women. Some foot deformities were so severe that women had difficulty walking without pain, yet they continued wearing fashionable footwear because the alternative, comfortable but unfashionable shoes, marked them as unsophisticated or lower class. The high heels that became fashionable in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods added additional problems. Heels shifted body weight forward onto the toes, causing pain and deformity. They changed walking gait and posture, often causing back pain. They made walking on uneven surfaces dangerous, leading to falls and injuries. Combined with long skirts that obscured the feet and made it difficult to see where one was stepping, heels created a genuine safety hazard. Victorian medical journals documented numerous injuries from falls caused by high heels, including broken bones, sprains, and head injuries. Boot and shoe materials also posed problems. Leather was expensive, so cheaper footwear often used leather substitutes or poor quality leather treated with chemicals. These materials could cause skin reactions, blisters, and infections. Dyes used to color leather sometimes contained toxic substances that could be absorbed through skin. The practice of blacking boots with polish containing various chemicals created exposure to substances that we now know are harmful. Working-class women who couldn't afford multiple pairs of shoes often wore the same damp, poorly ventilated footwear day after day, leading to fungal infections and foot problems that could become serious without proper treatment. The jewelry and accessories Victorian women wore could also be dangerous. Jewelry often contained toxic materials or presented physical hazards. Jet jewelry, extremely popular during the Victorian mourning culture, was usually safe as genuine jet is fossilized wood. But fake jet made from various materials, including glass, hard rubber, and plastics, could contain harmful substances. Some mourning jewelry incorporated hair from deceased loved ones, which could potentially carry diseases if the deceased had died from infectious causes, though this risk was not well understood at the time. Decorative feathers and taxidermy were popular accessories, with entire stuffed birds or large feathers adorning hats. The preservative chemicals used in taxidermy were often toxic, including arsenic compounds, mercury compounds, and formaldehyde. Women wearing elaborate bird-adorned hats were essentially wearing poison-preserved dead animals on their heads. Beyond the chemical exposure, the fashion for bird feathers contributed to the near extinction of several bird species, including egrets and birds of paradise, though this ecological harm was not recognized as problematic until conservation movements emerged in the late Victorian period. Parasols, those genteel accessories carried by respectable women for sun protection, could also be hazardous. The ribs and tips were often quite sharp, capable of causing injuries in crowds or during falls. More seriously, some parasols were treated with waterproofing compounds or dyes that contained toxic substances. The fashion for colored parasols meant exposure to the same problematic dyes used in clothing, just held close to the face where vapors and particles could be easily inhaled. The gloves that were essentially mandatory accessories for respectable Victorian women came with their own problems. Gloves were often dyed in fashionable colors using the same toxic dyes as clothing, including arsenic greens. Since gloves fit tightly against skin and were worn for extended periods, dye absorption was significant. Women who wore arsenic-dyed gloves regularly sometimes developed skin lesions on their hands and wrists. The practice of putting on gloves while they were still damp to achieve a tighter fit, making them more difficult to remove, increased skin contact time with any toxic dyes. Kid gloves, made from young goat leather, were particularly fashionable, but also particularly problematic. The softness and flexibility that made kid leather desirable required extensive chemical processing that could leave harmful residues. The cleaning methods for kid gloves often involve toxic substances, including benzene and other volatile organic solvents. Women who cleaned their own gloves at home inhaled these fumes. Professional glove cleaners suffered occupational exposure to these chemicals daily, sometimes developing serious health problems as a result. Subscribe now, because what you're about to discover about the Victorian baby clothing that poisoned and killed infants will shock you beyond belief. The dangers of Victorian fashion extended even to infants and children. whose clothing and care products were often as toxic as adult fashion. Baby clothes were frequently bleached to achieve fashionable whiteness using chlorine-based bleaches that could leave irritating residues. Some baby clothing was treated with lead-based whitening agents. The paints used to decorate cribs and toys often contained lead. Teething necklaces, believed to ease teething pain through some mystical property of the materials, were sometimes made from substances that were actually toxic if chewed or broken. Coral and amber teething necklaces were relatively harmless, but other varieties used materials that could be dangerous. Some teething toys were painted with lead paint, which babies put directly in their mouths. Rubber teething rings, introduced in the late Victorian period, sometimes contained toxic additives used in early rubber manufacturing. The white lead-based powder used on babies' skin to prevent chafing could cause lead poisoning if applied regularly. Parents literally poisoned their infants while trying to care for them, having no knowledge of the toxic substances in products marketed as safe for children. Children's clothing followed adult fashion trends in miniature, meaning children were also dressed in restrictive, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous garments. Young girls wore corseted dresses that began shaping their bodies long before puberty. Boys wore confining formal outfits that restricted movement and breathing. The fabrics and dyes used in children's clothing were the same toxic substances used in adult clothing, but children's smaller bodies and developing organ systems made them even more vulnerable to poison exposure. The particularly horrifying aspect of Victorian children's fashion was fancy dress for parties and theatrical performances. Children were often dressed in highly flammable materials for costume parties. The deaths of multiple children at a children's ball in Paris in 1897, when their costumes caught fire, sparked outrage. But similar incidents continued happening because the priority was creating pretty costumes, not ensuring children's safety. The flammable gauze and net used to create fairy costumes and angel wings ignited easily from candles and gas lights. Children died burning in their party costumes, while horrified parents watched, unable to save them. The toxic nursery extended beyond clothing to include wallpapers, paints, and furnishings in children's rooms. Arsenic green wallpaper, the same hazard we discussed earlier, was often used in nurseries because the bright color was considered cheerful for children. The off-gassing from arsenic wallpaper in poorly ventilated nursery rooms caused arsenic poisoning in babies and children, sometimes fatally. Several documented cases exist of children dying from apparent mysterious illnesses that were eventually traced to arsenic wallpaper in their nurseries. The symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, lethargy, were often attributed to common childhood illnesses, and the wallpaper connection was only discovered when multiple children in the same household became ill, or when an astute physician recognized the signs of arsenic poisoning. Lead paint was extensively used on furniture, walls, toys, and decorative items. Young children who chewed on cribs, toys, or furniture ingested lead paint chips and developed lead poisoning. The developmental impacts of childhood lead exposure are particularly devastating, causing permanent cognitive impairment, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems. Victorian children exposed to lead paint in their nurseries may have suffered lifelong consequences that were never connected to their childhood environment, because the mechanisms of lead neurotoxicity weren't understood. The Victorian approach to childhood illnesses also involved treatments that were sometimes more dangerous than the diseases they purportedly cured. Mercury compounds were used in teething powders and various medicines for children. Morphine and opium preparations were routinely given to infants and children to calm them or help them sleep, sometimes causing accidental overdoses. The patent medicine industry sold numerous products for children that contained alcohol, opiates, or other substances that we would now consider completely inappropriate for pediatric use. Parents administered these products believing they were helping their children, unaware they were sometimes poisoning them. The wet nurse system, common among wealthy Victorian families, presented its own risks. Wet nurses were sometimes given medications or substances to increase milk production, including various herbal preparations, and in some cases, beer or alcohol. These substances could transfer to the nursing infant. If a wet nurse used toxic cosmetics, including lead face powder, those toxins could potentially contaminate her milk. The hiring of wet nurses wasn't regulated, and families had little information about the health, habits, or exposures of the women nursing their babies. The working conditions of women employed in fashion-related industries deserve attention because they experienced occupational exposures that were often far worse than what consumers faced. Women working in dye factories, artificial flower factories, match factories, and clothing manufacturing were exposed to toxic substances constantly and in far higher concentrations than women who simply wore the finished products. These workers died in large numbers from occupational poisoning, but their deaths were often ignored or dismissed because they were working-class women whose lives were considered less valuable than those of the wealthy customers who purchased the products they made. The match factory workers, known as the match girls, provide one of the most famous and horrifying examples. In the late Victorian period, matches were made using white phosphorus, an extremely toxic substance. Women working in match factories suffered from phossy jaw, phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, a condition where the jawbone literally rotted away, causing extreme pain, disfigurement, and often death. The condition began with toothaches and jaw pain, progressed to severe bone deterioration, and could only be treated by surgical removal of the affected bone, which often meant removing large portions of the jaw. Workers with advanced phossy jaw were horrifically disfigured, their faces partially destroyed by the disease. The Match Girls strike of 1888 brought attention to these horrific working conditions. The strike was partially about wages and working hours, but it also highlighted the health hazards workers faced. The public outcry eventually led to regulations and the eventual replacement of white phosphorus with safer alternatives, but this took years, during which thousands more women were exposed. The Match Girls case illustrates how industrial production of fashion and consumer goods created acute health hazards for the workers who made them, hazards that were tolerated much longer than would have been acceptable if the victims had been wealthy or male. Women working in artificial flower factories faced the arsenic exposure we discussed earlier with Matilda Schurer's death. These workers handled arsenic-dyed materials constantly, breathing arsenic dust and absorbing the poison through their skin. Multiple deaths were documented, and many more workers likely suffered chronic health problems that were never officially connected to their occupation. The factories were usually poorly ventilated, maximizing workers' exposure to toxic dust and fumes. Factory owners resisted safety improvements because they would reduce profits, and workers who complained about conditions could simply be replaced from the large pool of desperate poor women needing employment. Dye factory workers faced exposure to a range of toxic substances, including aniline dyes, heavy metals, and various solvents. Aniline dye production involved chemicals that caused bladder cancer, though this connection wasn't firmly established until well into the 20th century. Workers handling these substances daily had far higher cancer rates than the general population. The colored fingers and nails of dye workers, stained from handling dyes, were a visible marker of their occupation and their chemical exposures. Some of these exposures were acute, causing immediate illness or death, while others were chronic, leading to cancers and organ damage that manifested years later. Clothing factory workers faced different hazards, including the physical strain of repetitive sewing, poor lighting that damaged vision, and exposure to fabric dust and sizing chemicals that caused respiratory problems. The working conditions in Victorian garment factories were often appalling, with long hours, poor ventilation, inadequate lighting, and dangerous machinery. Fire was a constant hazard in these cramped, fabric-filled spaces, and when fires occurred, the results were often catastrophic. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 in New York, while technically post-Victorian, illustrated the deadly conditions that had existed in garment factories throughout the Victorian era, conditions that killed women workers by the dozens when disasters struck. The economic pressures driving these dangerous working conditions were substantial. The fashion industry demanded cheap labor to produce affordable goods for expanding middle-class markets. Factory owners maximized profits by minimizing safety precautions and regulatory compliance. Workers were considered expendable, easily replaced if they died or became too ill to work. The Victorian class system meant that the deaths of poor working women simply mattered less than the deaths of wealthy women, receiving less attention and prompting fewer reforms despite occurring in larger numbers. The regulatory response to fashion-related deaths was slow, inconsistent, and often ineffective. Some reforms did emerge in the late Victorian period, driven by publicized tragedies, medical advocacy, and emerging labor movements. Regulations on certain chemical dyes were enacted in some jurisdictions. Workplace safety laws began addressing the worst factory conditions. Consumer protection regulations started requiring labeling of some dangerous products. But these reforms were patchwork, poorly enforced, and often resisted by industry that prioritized profits over safety. The resistance to reform often came from arguments that regulations would harm business, increase costs, reduce competitiveness, or interfere with consumer choice and free markets. Arguments that sound remarkably similar to contemporary debates over product safety and regulation. The Victorian era demonstrated that industry would not voluntarily abandon profitable but dangerous practices without external pressure from regulation, public opinion, or consumer action. The market alone did not solve these problems. It had created them by prioritizing aesthetic appeal and profit margins over human safety. The medical profession's response to fashion-related health problems was complicated by the gender dynamics of Victorian medicine and society. Male doctors sometimes dismissed women's health complaints as hysteria or inherent female weakness rather than investigating external causes. The very real symptoms of corseting, poisoning, and other fashion-related harms were sometimes attributed to women's supposedly delicate constitutions or even to moral failing, rather than to the obvious environmental causes. This medical gaslighting meant that many women suffered without proper diagnosis or treatment, and that connections between fashion and health were sometimes obscured by physicians' own prejudices. However, many Victorian physicians did recognize and campaign against fashion's health hazards. Medical journals published extensive documentation of fashion-related illnesses and injuries. Doctors wrote popular articles and books warning about cosmetic poisons, corset dangers, and clothing fires. Medical societies passed resolutions condemning dangerous fashion practices. Some physicians became active in reform movements, lending medical authority to arguments for dress reform and safer products. The medical evidence against Victorian fashion's most dangerous aspects was actually quite strong. The problem was that social and economic forces promoting those fashion practices were stronger than the medical evidence against them. The persistence of dangerous fashion despite known risks reveals the power of social pressure, cultural norms, and economic incentives to override individual safety concerns. Victorian women generally were not ignorant about fashion's dangers, at least not about the more obvious hazards like corset restriction and fire risk. Yet they continued participating in dangerous fashion because the social costs of not doing so seemed higher than the physical risks. A woman who abandoned her corset might face social ostracism, reduced marriage prospects, and family shame. A woman who refused to wear fashionable colors and styles might find herself excluded from the social circles that determined her entire life trajectory. In this context, accepting physical risk seemed rational, even when the dangers were known. This dynamic reveals uncomfortable truths about gendered social control and how beauty standards function as mechanisms of oppression. Victorian fashion's dangers weren't accidental. They were structural outcomes of a system that valued women's appearance over their health, their ornamental function over their comfort or safety, their compliance with beauty norms over their autonomy or well-being. The fashion industry and social pressure essentially coerced women into harming themselves, and then blamed them for vanity when they suffered consequences. Make sure you subscribe, because what finally forced Victorian society to abandon its most deadly fashion practices will absolutely astonish you. The eventual decline of Victorian fashion's most egregious dangers came through a combination of technological changes, social reforms, cultural shifts, and economic transformations rather than any single cause. The invention of synthetic dyes that didn't require arsenic or other heavy metals eventually made it possible to achieve fashionable colors without poison, though the transition was gradual and economically driven rather than motivated purely by safety concerns. The development of less flammable fabrics and fireproofing treatments reduced clothing fire deaths, though again this happened slowly over decades rather than all at once. The Edwardian era saw some loosening of Victorian fashion restrictions, with somewhat less extreme corseting and more flowing, less structured gowns coming into style. But genuine fashion liberation for women didn't really occur until World War I forced practical changes. Women entering war work needed clothing they could actually move in. And once they'd experienced the freedom of less restrictive dress, many resisted returning to Victorian constraints. The post-war period saw dramatic changes in women's fashion toward shorter, looser, less elaborate styles that were not only more comfortable, but genuinely safer. The regulation of cosmetics and consumer products also improved in the early 20th century, though comprehensive safety regulation didn't emerge until much later. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in the United States wasn't passed until 1938, and European countries had similarly delayed timelines for consumer product safety regulation. This meant that Victorian-era poisons in cosmetics and consumer products persisted well into the 20th century in some cases, continuing to harm women for decades after the Victorian era ended. The anti-corseting and dress reform movements that had struggled for attention in the Victorian period finally gained traction in the early 20th century. As women gained more social freedom, educational opportunities, and economic independence, they also gained more ability to resist oppressive fashion norms. The physical culture movement promoting exercise and athletic activity for women further undermined Victorian ideals of delicate, restricted femininity. Women athletes couldn't compete in corsets and impractical clothing, and their success challenged the ideology that had justified women's physical restriction. The changing role of women in society ultimately undermined the foundation of Victorian fashion's most dangerous aspects. When women were purely ornamental and their only social function was to marry well and manage households, fashion that prioritized appearance over function made a certain perverse sense within that system. But as women gained access to education, entered professions, claimed political rights through suffrage, and generally insisted on being treated as full human beings rather than decorative objects, fashion that literally prevented them from functioning became obviously incompatible with these new roles. You can't practice medicine, operate factory machinery, play sports, or engage in political activism while corseted into immobility and wearing clothing that might catch fire at any moment. The economic democratization of fashion also contributed to the decline of its most extreme dangers. Victorian high fashion was expensive and largely limited to the upper classes. Working-class women wore simpler, more practical clothing out of economic necessity, and this clothing was generally safer even if it lacked social prestige. As ready-to-wear clothing became more affordable and accessible in the early 20th century, fashion became less about demonstrating wealth through impractical excess and more about style that could be achieved at various price points. This democratization made extreme fashion less necessary as a class marker and reduced some of the social pressure to endure dangerous fashion. The advertising and media industries that developed in the early 20th century changed how fashion trends were created and disseminated. While these industries created new pressures and new potentially harmful beauty standards, they also broke the monopoly that high society had held over fashion dictates. Fashion became more diverse, changed more rapidly, and allowed for more individual interpretation rather than rigid conformity to single standards. This diversity, while bringing its own problems, at least meant that women who rejected the most dangerous fashion practices had more acceptable alternatives rather than facing complete social exclusion. The Victorian fashion death toll, while impossible to calculate precisely, was certainly substantial. Thousands of women died in clothing fires. Thousands more died from poisoning by cosmetics, dyes, and fashion chemicals. unknown numbers suffered chronic health problems from corseting, toxic exposures, and other fashion-related harms. Working-class women who manufactured fashion products died in even larger numbers from occupational exposures and accidents. When we romanticize Victorian fashion, admiring the beautiful gowns in museums or period dramas, we're looking at artifacts of a system that literally killed the women who wore these clothes. The lessons from Victorian fashion's deadly history remain relevant today. Modern fashion and beauty industries still sometimes prioritize appearance over health and safety. Toxic chemicals still appear in cosmetics and clothing, though usually in lower concentrations and subject to more regulation than in the Victorian era. Fast fashion's working conditions in developing countries echo the exploitative and dangerous conditions of Victorian garment factories. Beauty standards still pressure women, and increasingly men, to modify their bodies in ways that can be harmful, from extreme dieting to cosmetic surgery to steroid use. The fundamental dynamic where aesthetic ideals override health concerns hasn't disappeared, it's just taken new forms. The Victorian case also demonstrates that consumer choice alone doesn't solve safety problems, that industry self-regulation is insufficient, and that meaningful protections require external enforcement through regulation, public awareness, and social pressure. Victorian women knew their clothing was dangerous, and many wanted safer alternatives. But individual consumer decisions couldn't change an industry and culture built around dangerous products. Only collective action through reform movements, medical advocacy, regulatory changes, and cultural transformation eventually reduced fashion's deadly toll. The gendered nature of Victorian fashion dangers also deserves ongoing attention. While men's fashion also had some problematic elements, the most extreme dangers were concentrated in women's fashion, reflecting broader patterns of how women's bodies were and still are treated as objects to be modified for aesthetic appeal, regardless of cost. The Victorian expectation that women would accept physical harm, discomfort, and risk for the sake of beauty parallels modern pressures on women to undergo cosmetic procedures, wear uncomfortable footwear, maintain unrealistic body sizes, and generally prioritize appearance over comfort or health. The specific practices have changed, but the underlying logic that women's appearance matters more than their well-being persists. The Victorian era also demonstrates how normalized harm can become when embedded in cultural practices and economic systems. The fact that thousands of women burned to death in their clothing didn't stop crinolines from being fashionable for over a decade. The known toxicity of arsenic didn't stop its use in dyes for years after the dangers were publicized. The documented harms of tightlacing didn't end corseting. When dangerous practices are culturally entrenched, economically profitable, and tied to social status, they persist despite evidence of their harms. This normalization of danger happened in Victorian fashion, and it happens in modern contexts, from tobacco to unsafe vehicles to environmental pollution. The complicity of women themselves in perpetuating dangerous fashion practices is complicated and shouldn't be simplified into victim blaming. Victorian women weren't stupid or vain, they were trapped in a system that gave them few choices and severe consequences for non-conformity. Many genuinely didn't understand the full extent of fashion's dangers because information was limited and medical understanding was incomplete. Others understood the risks but correctly assessed that social risks outweighed physical risks in their constrained circumstances. Women who had more privilege, education, and independence were more likely to reject dangerous fashion, supporting the argument that the issue was systemic constraint rather than individual failing. The role of men in creating and perpetuating dangerous women's fashion also deserves examination. Men designed many of the most restrictive garments, though female dressmakers also participated. Men controlled the fashion industry's economic structures and regulatory environment. Men benefited from beauty standards that required women to demonstrate their attachment to men through impractical clothing that signaled they didn't need to work. Male physicians sometimes enforced fashion norms rather than challenging them. Male family members often pressured women to dress fashionably, regardless of discomfort or danger. While women participated in the system and sometimes enforced it on each other, The system itself was created and maintained largely by male economic and social power. The Victorian fashion tragedy also illustrates the importance of worker safety and occupational health protections. The women who made fashion products suffered even more than the women who wore them, but their suffering was less visible and less socially valued. The gradual development of workplace safety regulations, workers' rights to refuse unsafe work, and occupational health monitoring came partly from the horrific conditions in Victorian-era factories, including fashion industry workplaces. These protections remain important and remain contested, with ongoing debates about how much safety regulation is appropriate and who should bear the costs of protecting workers. The aesthetic legacy of Victorian fashion is complicated by its deadly history. We can appreciate the artistry and craftsmanship of Victorian clothing while also acknowledging the human cost. Museum exhibitions of Victorian dress sometimes now include information about the dangers these garments posed, educating viewers about the full context of these beautiful but deadly objects. This honest reckoning with history's dark aspects alongside its artistic achievements provides a more complete understanding than simple romanticization or condemnation. The Victorian period's toxic relationship with beauty and fashion ultimately collapsed under the combined weight of medical evidence, publicized tragedies, social reform movements, technological changes, and the fundamental incompatibility between Victorian fashion and women's expanding social roles. The transition wasn't clean or complete. Dangerous beauty practices persisted and new ones emerged, but the most egregious horrors of Victorian fashion did eventually end. That ending came not from industry voluntarily prioritizing safety, not from individual consumer choices alone, and not from men deciding to stop imposing harmful standards on women. It came from women and their allies fighting for change, from medical professionals documenting harms and demanding reforms, from tragic deaths finally forcing attention to problems that had been ignored for decades, and from economic and technological changes that made safer alternatives viable. The story of Victorian fashion's deadly price stands as a warning about what happens when appearance is valued over well-being, when profit matters more than safety, when social pressure overrides individual agency, and when vulnerable populations are treated as expendable. It's a story about the intersection of gender, class, capitalism, and body politics, about how beauty standards function as mechanisms of control, and about the human capacity to endure extraordinary harm when that harm is normalized and when alternatives are foreclosed. It's also a story about resistance, reform, and eventual change, demonstrating that even deeply entrenched harmful systems can be challenged and transformed when people organize, speak truth about harms, and insist that human well-being matters more than aesthetic ideals or economic profits. The women who died from Victorian fashion, who burned in their crinolines, who were slowly poisoned by their cosmetics and clothing, who crushed their organs in corsets, who suffered in countless ways, large and small, deserve to be remembered not just as victims but as people trapped in a system that valued their appearance over their lives. Their suffering and death eventually contributed to changes that benefited future generations, but they paid an enormous price for beauty standards they didn't create and couldn't escape. Their story reminds us to question beauty norms, to prioritize health over aesthetics, to demand safety in consumer products, to protect vulnerable workers, and to recognize that fashion is never just about clothing. It's always also about power, economics, and the value we place on different people's lives and well-being.